If you appreciate my videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help me keep on teaching, writing, and making videos, then please think about becoming a patron. So for anybody who's watching who doesn't know who I am, my name's Chris Hughes, and I write and make videos, and I teach online about Celtic things, mostly mythology and deities. And I'm running a course which starts at the end of June, which is aimed at people who are new to Celtic studies and Celtic paganism. So I thought I'd get people to send me a few questions and do a few Facebook Live sessions as a warm-up. So there are some links to my stuff in the description that goes with this video. This time I'm going to be responding to a question about the migrations of the ancient Celts. So this is a request for a sort of a refresher from someone who vaguely remembers that she learned in school that the Celts migrated from somewhere in the east and went west and ended up in Britain. I think that's a great place to start. So scholars have worked on this question of Celtic migrations for several centuries now, especially since the 19th century. And slowly but surely, they've found pieces of puzzles about the Celts. I'm talking about the Celts in continental Europe right now. And they've built theories, archaeological theories, linguistic theories, ethnological theories, but they haven't figured it out yet. So my advice to you is don't get too emotionally invested in a particular theory. That's kind of good planning with most things to do with the Celts, because we do struggle to reach, an agreed theory about things because the evidence is so sparse. So most researchers are wrong sometimes, and that same researcher may very well be right the next time. So also don't discount somebody because they said something wrong. It's almost inevitable when you're trying to push studies forward that people mess up. So Celtic studies combines several disciplines, as I mentioned, and people tend to go outside their own area of expertise quite a bit. People who are more into the linguistic side base things on archaeology and so on. And that's one reason I think that so many mistakes have been made, is because a linguist won't necessarily recognize an archaeologist's mistake. An archaeologist may not recognize a historian's mistake, and so on. And so over the last century or two, they built this theory and built this theory, and it's gotten more and more wobbly as a result. So it's inevitable that eventually the whole thing kind of collapsed, which is what I'm going to talk about. Now, it's important to use up-to-date information when you're studying things like this, because the field of archaeology and cultural migrations, genetics, linguistics, it's moving quite fast right now. So a 15 or 20-year-old paper is out of date, sadly. So in particular, to get ready to do this talk, I referred to a paper that was published in April 2020 by a widely respected Celticist called Patrick Sims-Williams, who's at Cambridge University. And the name of the paper is An Alternative to Celtic from the East and Celtic from the West. And there's a link to this paper in the description of this video, because it's actually available online, even though it's so new. So the good thing about this paper is it contains useful descriptions of how the theory of Celtic migrations has evolved over the period of scholarship that studied it, and how really all of those theories have been disproven. Now, Patrick Sims-Williams puts forward his own theory briefly. I don't know if it's really the point of his paper, but he has his theory, and I will share that with you. But it's not really the important point here. The important point is his analysis of the situation. So let's look at some maps now, if I can find my screen here. So the idea that Central Europe generally, and Hallstatt in what's now Austria, and La Tene to a lesser extent, is the cradle of the Celts, in other words, where the Celts originated, was the predominant view for over 100 years. According to this theory, Celtic culture sprang forth here, and not quite out of nowhere, but near enough, after which Celtic people spread in many directions. So you can see all these arrows going everywhere. But especially that it spread westward into Gaul, which is the area I'm circling with my pointer, and then eventually into Britain and Ireland. And for a long time, most of the arguments were simply about what routes the Celts took and at what dates they were in certain places. For example, did people travel to Ireland directly by sea from Iberia, from Spain and Portugal, or did they go across Britain to get to Ireland? That was among the things which were discussed. And as you can see from this first map, La Tene and Hallstatt are quite far north and east in this paradigm. So that's worth keeping in mind for what's coming. So all these pinker areas are Celtic areas where the Celts spread to eventually, and that's not in question, I don't think. That part still holds true. This map's fairly nuanced, and unlike the tongue-in-cheek thing that I shared to advertise the talk, which had a big arrow going from Hallstatt straight to Ireland, in one straight line. This kind of shows how the Celts maybe got to the places they went. This map doesn't reflect all the theories that came and went within this paradigm, though, because if you tried to do that, the map would just be a mess. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists and linguists often built on one another's work without really understanding it, as I said, and that was bound to unravel. So as the 20th century progressed and archaeology especially became much more methodical and scientific, and so did linguistics, the archaeologists and the linguists started to see things in quite different ways. So quite a bit about Celtic languages came into focus during the 20th century, while the picture for the archaeologists about the Celts became less and less distinct. The material culture of the Celts, that's their pottery and their burials and their buildings, were really quite hard to distinguish from those of their near neighbors. But their language is very clearly different. So the linguists were having a field day, and the archaeologists were kind of struggling with this whole Celt thing. So it's not surprising that from the archaeologists that we begin to hear that, well, maybe the Celts weren't really a race. Maybe they weren't really a clearly defined culture, and so on. So welcome to Celto-scepticism, which really reared its head in the 80s. So I think Celto-scepticism presents a cautionary tale as far as how the popular imagination, and that's you and me, unless you're an archaeologist or a Celticist or something like that, how the popular imagination kind of misinterprets new academic ideas, and the press often contributes to that misinterpretation by simplifying things and making a big headline and never really, getting into the weeds. At the same time, I understand the frustration of the Celto-skeptics who were struggling to define Celts by their material culture, just at the time when, popular culture was having this kind of second Celtic revival fueled by Celtic music and things like that. So people were calling many things Celtic, which really weren't Celtic in the popular world. And that was finding its way into academia, no doubt. One unfortunate result is, though, that some lay people now think that there's no such thing as Celtic. In contrast, most people in university departments, both archaeologists and linguists, now just agree that the term needs to be defined carefully in whatever context it's being used. And you'll see that in almost every academic paper or book on Celtic things now, the term Celtic being defined by the author before they get going. It's also generally agreed that Celtic is a much better descriptor for people who speak a Celtic language, or perhaps live in a region where that language was fairly recently spoken, and maybe have a kind of a culture that comes with that language. It's not a great descriptor for something like a race of people, an ethnic group. So the disconnect that led to Celto-scepticism was real, and the Hallstatt-La Tene Western movement theory wasn't standing up to the evidence. And this left a bit of a vacuum, which still hasn't really been filled by a really convincing theory, although it looked like one was on the horizon a few years ago. So this theory is usually called Celts from the West, or the Atlantic fringe theory. The idea is that Celtic languages grew up along the Atlantic and North Sea coastal areas, marked in yellow on this map, where it spread out into Gaul. So now we're going east instead of west, and then into the other areas that became Celtic, so into Turkey and so on. So then it probably underwent some further development and moved around. It isn't really as simple as this one arrow, the Atlantic fringe theory, or Celts from the West. It probably involves some circling back here and there, at least once or twice. So this theory has been really well promoted by a really well-respected archaeologist called Professor Barry Cunliffe, and his very talented colleague from the linguistic side of things, Dr. John Koch. So many people, very much me included, were pretty excited about this 5 or 10 years ago. However, it hasn't stood up very well to peer review. In other words, other experts, having looked at their work, just most of them are not convinced that it's correct. I don't have the expertise to go into an analysis of some of that, but I'll mention one crucial part, which I followed pretty closely. And we go back to this previous slide. You can see there's a Celtic area down here in, where's my pointer gone? There it is. Down here in central Spain, which is sometimes called Celtic Iberia or Celt Iberia. But you'll notice that it's not contiguous with Gaul, with the Celts in Gaul. This is the Pyrenees Mountains here, and that's Basque speaking, and that kind of has cut off the Celts. And this particular map has conjectured that they kind of went around the edge of the Pyrenees and got to Celt Iberia that way, which is possible. But it's a problem. Why is there this big gap where there's no Celtic stuff? Down here in Celt Iberia, there's some Celtic inscriptions, and they're earlier than anything at Hallstatt or La Tene and other Celtic stuff, not just inscriptions. So the Celtic stuff down here is slightly earlier than Hallstatt-La Tene, and it took archaeologists, most of the 20th century to really be sure about that. But obviously that kind of ruined the Hallstatt as the cradle of the Celts theory. Now this other little region down here around Cadiz, there's a group of inscriptions which no one had managed to translate until John Koch thought he'd cracked them in the 2010s. And he read them as Celtic and proposed translations based on words that appeared to have cognates in Celtic languages, both ancient Celtic languages and modern. And many people found this convincing. And as someone with just a smattering of Celtic languages, I could certainly see what he was getting at. However, many other linguists and philologists, those are people who study words, still aren't really convinced that the inscriptions are Celtic. and what I think doesn't really matter, because it's just an opinion. I'm not an academic linguist or philologist, so my opinion isn't really the point here. So Barry Cunliffe, the main proponent of Celtic from the West in archaeology, continues to modify his ideas, and he's backpedaled a little bit or come up with some other explanations for some things. But Barry's like 80 now, so I can't see him pushing the work a lot further forward now. There's some arguments that some of his original hypotheses were poorly reasoned. And to some extent, he was relying on John Koch's work, translating the inscriptions down here in the Southwest to sort of corroborate his archaeological theories. Now, John Koch himself is a very brilliant scholar, and he's very widely respected. And he continues to defend his interpretation of the Southwestern inscriptions as containing a great deal of Celtic vocabulary. But he's also said that just turning the arrow around, like in that other map I showed you, that's way too simplistic. That's not the answer. So right now, the best we could say about Celts from the West is it's not proven, and it's not being well accepted in academia. I think it was possibly better accepted 5 or 10 years ago until people had time to really take it apart and look at it. And now they're not happy. And I don't think that's just academic conservatism. I think there's more to it than that. So right now, about all we can say is, yes, there were Celts at Hallstatt, there were Celts at La Tene. La Tene art is real, but these aren't points of origin. So Patrick Sims Williams, the author of the paper I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, gives a fairly short but convincing kind of opening argument to the idea that the Celts actually probably originated in Gaul, so sort of central France, that area there. Certainly that would be a simpler answer to deal with, although I'm sure there are all sorts of things then that are hard to explain. So it isn't proven, he's just proposing it. And you may be waiting for me to come to the part about genetics, but I'm going to disappoint you. For one thing, genetics can't really tell us what language anyone spoke. This is the same problem that archaeologists found with trying to identify the Celts by their pots and their weapons. So companies that offer to analyze your DNA and tell you about your ancient ancestors can't really do that either with any accuracy. So Celtic is basically a language group and the cultural package that tends to go with that language. We have evidence of Celtic people moving in pretty much every direction in Europe, as natives of a region are going to do. So the ancient Celts or the proto-Celts were not like some monolithic culture speaking a monolithic dialect called Proto-Celtic. It's much more messy than that. And the package of related Celtic languages and cultures may have been spread in many ways other than simple migration, changes in population involving people from the steppes moving west, which would be a bit pre-Celtic by most theories, may not explain the later rise, probably later, in Celtic language and culture. So we're at a bit of an impasse right now, I think, with the whole Celtic migration situation. So that's the bad news. So the reason that I decided to make these videos was to promote a course I'm going to be teaching starting on June 26th called Celtic Beginnings, which is, I hate phrases like this, but it's kind of like Celtic stuff for dummies. I think that's a bit rude sounding, but it's meant for people who need to fill in some bits, or they're just new to Celtic paganism or new to Celtic studies and want to get started with good information. So I'm really all about accurate information. And I'm more about mythology and deities really than I am about history. But I've had 2 questions about history. I talked about the Druids. I'll be talking about something to do with Celtic deities in the next one, which is the 5th of June. And that one will be at 12 noon Pacific, 8 p.m. UK time. Fill in if your time zone is in between those two. So thank you very much for listening. And I think I will end the meeting here and see you next time.